All right, the country's screwed. America's dead because the Constitution is. We feel it's kind of time to cut loose and let all the woke citizens go create their own utopia, and we'll stay with ours. And it all started with the 14th Amendment. So we'll get on into that on this episode of American Reckoning podcast.
Don't talk to me, I don't believe a word. Don't try to make me feel alright.
All right, hey, this American Reckoning podcast, where we talk about our Confederate ancestors, Confederate history, Southern heritage. We talk about the modern day woke craziness that's going on. In this particular episode here, this is episode number 10 for American Reckoning podcast. I am Paul. You see Aaron there, and we've got Bobby and Todd. So appreciate you guys coming on. I haven't seen you in a while. So we're going to be talking about the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And the 14th Amendment was a really long and complicated, and it still remains to this day, amendment. And there's a lot of problems with it, and it has caused a lot of problems and a lot of division in our country. And it was born out of division and hatred, what we think, hatred towards the Southern people, the Southern citizens of the Southern states, who Lincoln and the Republicans, although Lincoln was dead at this time, his acolytes in the radical Republican Party not only won the war, but they wanted to make the South pay. They wanted to make the South pay. And one way to do that was the 14th Amendment and some of the provisions within that. I don't want to get deep into reading the 14th Amendment because, like I said, go ahead and take a look at it yourself. It's very convoluted, unpleasant reading, except for a bunch of super geek out scholars, I guess. So when I'll ask, I'm gonna read some from the Kennedy's book, "The South is Right," on the 14th Amendment, on what they thought, and they made some incredibly clear and convincing analysis and facts that they bring out that most people do not know about. Not only the elements, the particulars of the 14th Amendment and why it's important, what it is, what happened and everything, but also the incredibly, basically, the 14th Amendment today should not be an amendment. It was ratified under the most dubious conditions. It was a complete farce. And we're going to get into that. So I'll read some of this, but I wanted to ask you guys, does anybody have any, before we get started, some thoughts about the 14th Amendment, what you guys know? Because I grew up, I didn't know what the heck, I knew what the first 10 amendments were, the Bill of Rights. But ironically speaking, the Bill of Rights are not guaranteed. They're taken away from the states, in this case, the Southern states. So anybody have any comment on that?
Well, I've got an initial comment, and it's not all of what I think about it, but it's something to be noted that the only thing I learned in school growing up about the 14th Amendment was that it gave freedmen the right to vote. And I think that's an incredibly lacking way to understand it, in the sense that it did so many things, and it was a very convoluted and complicated amendment. And the idea that people of not only the generation in which I grew up, but others since, I'm sure it can't be any better for them, have this very limited, as if this was the only thing important about it. It did this as a consequence of what it did. And to get into all the aspects of it, it's not even that cohesive, that it all just meant that. I mean, there were so many things about it that were not only disconnected but very problematic. But anyway, that's my thought for the moment.
Well, the other thing is that I think is really significant is how the nation's viewed from then on. It's 1868 when the United States stops being a plural, a loose association of states, sovereign states, and now it's one. These United States, and now it's the United States.
Right.
The singular. They're all under the federal government now, and they're all bound to that instead of that sovereign state independence.
Right. The United States are versus the United States is.
Mm.
Yeah, I think what people have to understand, and this is kind of leading up to the 14th Amendment. Remember, I mean, prior to Lincoln's invasion in the war, the War of Southern Independence, and the 14th Amendment ratification, states were their own sovereigns, as you mentioned. And most citizens were citizens of their states, not the United States. And that's the point you're making. And so just, you have to let that sink in for a little bit. Every citizen, people did not feel a part of the United States. They felt a part of their state, their region, their immediate region. It was their home, their land, their property. That's how America was. It was not a United States federal government
monstrosity.
Yeah, I mean, take your pick of words that we see all the way to today. It's an overarching. It is a national. It's a nation. People did not look at their country that way. And so this was an earth-shattering thing. The war was earth-shattering in and of itself, but then you follow on with this, and we'll get into here why it was even many northern states did not, some of the states that ratified did not actually ratify it. They were usurped. I'm talking about states like Ohio and Oregon, states like New Jersey. So we'll get into this, but anyway, some of the effects of what can any of you guys kind of go through some of the effects that we talked initially about. The state courts were really prominent, and now they're not. So the federal courts basically subsume the state courts, and what that really means. So everyone's kind of nationalized. We're not really.
Well, yeah, certainly some of the effect of it was, and I don't know how much exactly the 14th contributed to this, though it certainly did contribute to it, where the Supreme Court became the arbiter of everything. Right. If you go back to the time of Jefferson himself would say, and there are certain things a lot of us would like about what I'm about to say and not like about it in other ways. But Jefferson used to talk about how basically a state could do whatever they wanted. The whole idea is the Supreme Court was not actually supposed to be superior to the state courts. It was supposed to only judge on what the federal government could do. So take any of the Bill of Rights, for example. It was based on that Congress shall pass no law thing. The federal government was not permitted to make laws about guns or about a religion or about free speech. However, in Jefferson's view, the states could. And there are stories about various ways he dealt with this in his time as president and as vice president, and in various other capacities. But yeah, his idea was, all this does is limit the federal government. Sorry, feel bad for you up in Massachusetts if what was it, the Danbury Baptists or something like that?
Right. Yeah.
Always one of those, and that's really so contrary to the way we've all grown up, with the Supreme Court basically being the final arbiter and the overarching final rule. Whereas some of the rulings they've been coming out recently with are much better, of course, because it kicks things back to the states where they should have been in the first place, and that should have been the foregone conclusion.
And that's only because you have some conservative originalist judges now on the Supreme Court.
Right.
You can thank Trump, I guess, for that, for 3 of them at least. But for
Even
them
in
to be
that
able to
case, even in that case, though, they are still in a position of central authority having to make that ruling.
Right,
You know?
exactly.
So it's ironic.
it's the best we can get. Yeah, it's really a pathetic position to be in. State courts, but going back, the state courts don't really mean anything if you think about it. I'll just go ahead to if it's an equal protection thing, I just go, I don't need the state court. What do I need them for?
Right.
I'll just go straight on up to the Supreme Court.
Right. You take it as far as you can in the state. And if that doesn't please you and you can find some sort of federal way you can do it, you can bring it into the federal court system and potentially even to the Supreme Court. So, So that's also part of the state sovereignty issue, but more to come on.
So there's a court thing. And then another thing is this notion of incorporation. So it basically, if you guys can think about examples of something being incorporated versus something that's pretty, free, open, a small government, a small community, but then it's like unincorporated, then it becomes incorporated, and what that means.
Because that's about. Do you mean like specific elements of a state or a community that become subsumed under a federal situation?
As an example, exactly.
Education. Education for one. Heck, look at something, all kinds of elements of private business. At least today, we can be thankful that in order to go into business, you don't have to have a federal license to, start a corporation or something, though you do have a bunch of federal obligations, tax-wise, and in other ways, when you start a business. But yes, when it comes to education, when it comes to there's the Department of Education. Then there are ways in which the other things are incorporated through influence, and I could get into that, like farming or whatever. But go ahead.
Well, I'm talking about also like the United States is this one big corporate entity that rules, governs everything, all the citizens now. It's no longer their individual rights, property, liberties, etc.
Right. We are all subjects.
We're subjects.
Right.
That's what the 14th Amendment did. It made the United States the United States of America, Inc.
Right.
And
the collective.
I always think about that because I live in a small town and there's not one traffic light.
Right.
All the people here and the community size matters, right?
Right.
But they go around and they kind of govern themselves, and nobody messes around shooting anybody or does anything stupid, or the crime is extremely low. You get some people here having a good time or whatever, but people govern themselves.
Right.
If someone's in need, they help each other. And, so that's, if this town were to go and get incorporated, then you've got a town manager, you've got a court, you've got the sheriff, you've got this cascade of government that comes in.
Incorporated is just a fancy word for progressive liberalism.
That's what it results in. That's certainly true.
That's what it results into. And I live in city limits. I see it every day.
That's right.
Regulations and rules.
Yeah. And they don't want you to run your own life. They want to run it for you.
Right. The whole point is the regulations and rules are unnecessary.
Yeah.
And of course, when a town becomes incorporated and has its own, I'm sure even in the little town that you live in, there are some minimal things that establish it as a town. But just like anything else, when you get that situation started, all of a sudden it starts to, just like any government entity, or strange crossover in a way, maybe a natural one, businesses, they tend to grow. They tend to try and look to ways that they can offer more service for more compensation. The big difference is with a town, they can extract it from you by force. It is no longer voluntary at that point. When you are a citizen of a town and enough people vote and whatever, it becomes incorporated. All of a sudden, you have a growing entity that doesn't know when to stop growing. It can only grow as fast as its revenue will allow it. Sometimes they try
And
and rush
there's
that by
people-
extracting. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, there's people that want to extend that. There's people that absolutely feel happy as a clam in that kind of environment. And
More
there's
comfortable,
people,
in fact.
Mhm.
So many. Yes, absolutely.
so
Cool.
Which,
yeah,
you know,
I mean, one of the other effects, I mean, we're talking about this before, is this thing about naturalized citizens, what the 14th Amendment did, with this thing called anchor babies, where, you know, a pregnant illegal alien comes across the border, has a child in the United States or within the territorial boundaries, and they're a citizen.
Right.
You know, that's part of the 14th Amendment.
Right.
That's a
Well,
loophole. But
Well, and so birthright citizenship, you know, a lot of people never asked the question before there was birthright citizenship, how did people become citizens before that? And usually it came down, and I forget what the exact law is, but it had something to do with whether their parents were citizens or not. You remember John McCain? He was technically born outside
right,
the United
at an
States
army
because
base or
yeah. And
US
of
Air
course,
Force or whatever it was,
still
naval
completely
station.
legit because he still fell under that older understanding, and that's why he was allowed to run for president. Supposedly,
That's just the same with Kamala.
right,
She is actually ineligible
to be president,
to be vice president,
to be vice president.
according to those standards, because parents have to be
Citizens.
Mhm.
And very interesting. Yes, yeah, I didn't realize that was the case with her. That's cool. Yeah, that's very interesting to know. But yeah. Well, of course, and no modern Western country has that. Not like we should be doing everything they do, but there are good reasons why they've discontinued that practice, and the fact that we hold on to it is not a good one. The whole and people always complain about and this is not about immigration, but pertinent to the topic, it has a big effect on it. That being the case, you end up with a situation where you know, there are all kinds of rhetorics out there about why immigration status matters. Well, it matters because you know, in order to have a nation, which I've argued we really haven't had possibly ever, but certainly not for a long time as of today, and that's a different discussion, but true or not, if you're going to have a nation, if the presumption is you're going to have a nation, you need to have a relatively socially homogenous or culturally homogenous community. And when you have too many cultures coming in too quickly, there's no combination there. And you end up with the situation that we have today, where now, and this gets to my argument why I think we have a bunch of nations in the country right now, not the one nation we supposedly have because we're all under the same law. But yeah, all you do is add to that where you don't have a nation. So that's the reason why birthright citizenship matters. And I can get more into that later. But
I think,
to your point,
you know, one of the effects today to apply today, I think that states, I think we're reaching, I hope in a sense, we're reaching a point where states may, God, it would be nice. I always think of a world where we could sort of revert back to before the 14th Amendment. And, you know, when we had the Bill of Rights and every state was sovereign and they can make their own rules, and you didn't have this overarching crap show that we have now. And it's funny because if you think about it, some of the most liberal, radical, left-wing, ultra left-wing nutbag states out there, like California and Massachusetts and now Maryland, New York, Illinois, all of them, you know, they want to have abortion on demand. They want to have freaking drag queens, you know, have sex with 6-year-old boys, or, you know, they want to mate with armadillos, whatever the heck it is. Go right the hell ahead. Go right ahead. And let all and so everybody wants to do that. Go into Massachusetts and California and have a field day.
right? Theoretically,
Leave the rest of us states alone.
Yeah. Well,
So that the interesting thing is that we that's sovereignty, like it or not, for evil or for good.
Right.
But you have the right to choose what kind of path you take in this world.
More
and if you want to be sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, to your point, that's federalism.
That's federalism. Correct.
You should have, and Livingston often says, you kind of have to have a federal soul. You got to let California be California. Yeah. If we were, and I'm afraid to say, if even if we were in a better situation federalism wise, we might still be in trouble because people would start to see some terrible things happen other places and start to scream bloody murder about it.
But that's
maybe rightfully they should. But is that a better?
That's fine.
Is that a better problem or a worse problem? I would contend it's a better problem to have.
I think it's a better problem. I do too. I don't know how you guys think. What do you guys think?
I think the founders, when they set up the country, recognized that the culture and the people who settled in New England are much different than the people that settled in the Gulf, or South Carolina, or name one,
Florida.
So the differences in the cultures and the people, and we know before everything became universal on TV and radio and everything. All these states had their own unique identity and individualism. And that's why the founders set it up like this, because what the people of Massachusetts feel is right may not be the same as what the people of Texas feel is right, or Florida. And so they set it up, except for the basic God-given rights that each culture, each state could guide themselves. It was local rule.
Right. Bottom up.
Yeah.
And now we've got the top down.
Exactly.
And this started
trying to hammer everybody into this one identity, this one culture set. And it's not a well-functioning,
it's not natural
at this point.
It's not functioning for a long time. It's also not natural.
No,
it's not natural. The economy in the North, and we take it back to the war between the states, and the economies were different. The cultures are different. This had been going on since darn near the ratification of the U.S. the original U.S. Constitution, and before.
Yeah.
Our issue with England, we had culturally separated. We had been here for 200 years or so by then, and
that's true.
So this is a natural thing, and so that's what was the genius of some of the founders, if we could keep it, is to recognize that natural tendency, that natural law, that culture, that those regional differences.
Well, and that was supposed to be the idea behind the Federal Republic, a federal republic, not a federal democracy, not a federal unitary state. We are supposed to have a federal republic. Nominally, we do. It's still the federal government, but it hasn't been functionally federal for longer than it ever was to begin with. That
term you mentioned, you mentioned it really well there. Federal democracy. I mean, everybody says today, we're fighting for democracy.
Right.
Do you know what an asinine thing that is to say?
Well, it really is. I think people have this abstract idea about democracy as in it's just where everybody gets their say on their vote, and that makes sense and that's understandable. Yeah.
That's an infantile understanding of what.
Right. In other words, yes, it's like a basic definition, and a republic is a place where everybody votes, but there's representatives involved in that, and the reason why that's important is because when you have pure democracy, you end up with mob rule. And you've seen
you have the tyranny of the minority. The minorities are blurted out.
Tyranny of the majority, specifically.
Tyranny of the majority. Sorry, against the minority.
Any unpopular minority. And there have been extreme examples in certain African states that in the 20th century, where they were recently freed from European colonial rule, and they started to get into these things. They started to do democracy. And so you'd have situations where 51% votes to dispossess the remaining 49, and it could go. That's not good governance. And I don't think anybody would agree that it is. That's the reason why republics matter. That's why the founders designed the federal government as a republic,
as based on representation, and the representation has gotten so far out of whack.
Right, the
with this
representation is not
push
good.
to democracy and all this horse dung.
The average
And really, what you're doing,
representation-
it causes such division between our own fellow people, because in every election, Republican, Democrat, it's all about who's going to put who on the Supreme Court, rather than
Right.
it's completely lost in this nationalistic battle of stupidity.
And the lack of federalism.
Go ahead, Bob.
Go ahead.
Well, let's not forget, number one, that the term democracy was created by the Greeks. The Greeks created democracy.
Yes.
Somewhere along the line in our historical retrospect, the U.S. has adopted that as we're democracy, and it's preached 24/7, right?
It is now.
It is now.
Yeah.
Where we are still a constitutional republic, number one.
We're not a constitutional republic.
Well,
Come back to that.
in sense. Number two is that getting back to, if you want to get back to 14th Amendment and the South and that time period, today, and I say this with great reverence, the South is still the only section of the country that still has a true identity. If you look at anywhere else in the country, North, Midwest, Western states, they've gone awry.
I would put a point on that just by saying I agree with you, and I think it has the most distinct identity.
Yeah.
But I think part of that is that the whole nation following the so-called Civil War was New Englandized, and that was part of the point of that. You can still see a number of distinct cultures throughout the Southwest, West Coast, even Northwest. I mean, it's not a great one. What do they got? Grunge. They got Nirvana. Great. Enjoy. I'd much rather have Stonewall Jackson. But so my whole point is there are a number of distinct cultures that could represent a cultural nationhood throughout the country. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, we've also got to separate ourselves from the terminology of Civil War, right? It really
That's
wasn't
why I say so-called
Civil War, right? You can call it what you want. War between the states. I like to call it war of northern aggression.
That's accurate,
right? And so, like you have to
Southern
separate
independence
yourself.
and
War Southern independence is a good one too.
Our second independence.
That's why that's why the New Englandized, Yankified, whatever, still wants to full-throated destroy the South, the culture. That's why the Confederate flag, they everything is associated with racism and slavery, and white supremacy,
because they know.
That's constant. They know.
They know the South's right.
Need to denigrate. They need to denigrate the South. They know that they hold the truth. They know that the culture is the most together in terms of its allegiance to those individual liberties that they've had from. It's eroding. It's eroding, but I'd say still it's there.
I'd say it's eroded. I think it's gone almost as far as it can.
We all know what scares a liberal the most.
Oh yeah,
the truth.
The truth, they can't handle it.
That would imply they know they're in the wrong. With Straussian conservatives of today, I think they don't know they're in the wrong. I think they
don't, because they've
totally
latched onto this fort.
They have I grew up going to school and learning this misconception of history. And it's so flimsy when you actually just get into it a little bit. It becomes so obviously not in evidence that it's ridiculous to keep on going with. But people, even once they learn that, see that as a sidebar. Oh, that was part of it, but it's still really this. And it's just a belief system. And
they have to latch it.
It's really hard to break people of a belief system.
They have to latch on to.
Well, especially if you love America.
They're originalists.
If you love America, you're not going to say it's going to be hard for you to go back and and you're really going to have to be intellectually honest. And I'm not going to say open-minded, because if you're really open-minded, you're just going to be stupid. But you've got to be critical, is my point. You've got to be critical. And it's really hard to persuade these people that Lincoln did some of the worst things any president has ever done, if not the worst things, when it comes to our Constitution and why our federalism died. I say it again and again. That's why I got into, because I used to be into the so-called Civil War because I loved the generals and the battles and all that kind of stuff. And then I got older, and I started to get into the whole political history, the philosophical history of it. And it's so completely evident that it's undeniable then. And so it's really hard to sell people, especially here we are on the 3rd of July, the 4th of July is tomorrow, and I'm going to say, Lincoln is not all he's cracked up to be. It's not that hard to learn this. I mean, it's almost except for just the veneer of what you've been taught in school. But when you go back and look at any primary sources, it's immediately evident. It is just immediately evident. It's so obvious. The entire education on this period treats us all like morons.
I got into a battle with this guy on Facebook. Stupid move. What a worthless. He was from New York, from Attica.
You thought you could learn him something, huh?
You know what?
Facts don't matter.
Facts don't matter. But I'll tell you one thing. I said, look, he had to apologize because he insulted me, and I just kind of brushed it off. But I told him, apology accepted. I said, but what you really need to do, go read Thomas DiLorenzo's The Real Lincoln.
DiLorenzo was originally from Pennsylvania, not a Southerner.
Exactly. Or this newer book that's written by a Vermonter. Right.
Oh, yes. Yeah. The one from Dixie, our last episode. Yes.
Correct.
Defending Dixie's land. Yes. Yes. That's a good, I need to get that one myself.
So it just don't take my word for it on Facebook. Go read something. It's not that I'm insulting your intelligence. Go read. Go look outside of what you have been taught and outside your box, your comfort zone. You may not agree with me because I'm a Southerner and I'm culturally different, and I don't like you driving down 95 down into Florida any more than whatever. I don't go up in New York, brother. But just go read now and learn something of why the South's perspective on things.
Well, let me ask you a question
because you're used to only seeing it from your point of view, your perspective. Try the other point of view and stop insulting my intelligence by calling the cause of the war slavery. It was not slavery.
Forget about the other point of view. What should they not read? I would say anything from, it depends on who you go for, but primarily anything from the end of the war on. I would suggest read primary sources. Primary sources of the time. They're readily available. You can get them online. You can get them anywhere. What was actually going on? What was the basis upon which people were actually making their decisions at the time?
They got the blinders on about
threats they had to prepare for. What was actually going on? Almost everything everybody learns is a Monday morning quarterback to times infinity. I mean, more books have been written on Lincoln than almost anybody else, and they're all after the fact, and they're all mostly garbage. And that's what I'm getting at. There's a huge body of work that has just a bunch. You could say it's one-sided, but it's just bad material. It's bad history. It's people thinking deductively rather than inductively.
I actually think there's some people coming around to the notion that Lincoln really wasn't a great president. Even that Lincoln did actually do some really unconstitutional, lied. There's a lot of things coming out if people just
I agree with you.
Freaking look into it a little more.
Yeah, more than ever.
And I'm talking our audience, we're most people watching this podcast are pro-Southern and for the most part. But I'm always hoping that there's somebody out there who may be watching. You can hate the podcast or whatever, but I don't give a crap about that. I'm trying to reach, all of us are trying to reach to change some of the mindset. Open some of the minds of some of our respective citizens who may not agree with us. And that's that even some Republicans and so-called conservatives who think they're conservative,
I would say most,
most,
especially on the
I'm
national
telling
level.
you, man, you gotta dial it back a little bit,
Yeah.
eat some humble pie, and go
If you-
ahead and read some.
If you love
About-
America, you're going to have to learn to divorce Lincoln from that, you know?
Yeah.
And that's the problem. Lincoln, you cannot love Lincoln and Jefferson in the same way. Their ideas are non-commensurate. If you think Jefferson was great, which I do, he was not without his flaws. He wasn't perfect, but that is the spirit of America. I'm amongst other people back then, but there was,
one thing.
Go ahead.
One thing that is really difficult to do, and I would challenge anybody to do it, and that is to read some of the dissenting decisions from early back, even in the early 1800s. So, for example, Spencer Roane versus John Marshall, right? Some John Marshall's thinking eventually won out as we push towards No one remembers a more central authority related governance. But Spencer Roane, John Taylor, Reed, these are Virginians. John Randall, read some of these guys.
Yeah.
Because they're beyond Thomas Jefferson. They're beyond James Madison, James Monroe. Read some of them because it is absolutely eye-opening what defenders of individual liberties, had they won out, we would have, would have not gone off the road into it. Spencer Roane had a chance to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court,
right?
But he was so against it. He did not believe in the Supreme Court because of its overreaching power at the time and didn't even consider it.
Well, and that just goes to show
Jefferson could have appointed him, and neither of them wanted. That's what's so crazy. It's like neither of them. It's like, you know what the heck? Let John Marshall get this.
Well,
we don't think it's totally legitimate anyway. Go ahead.
There are some really interesting things back then that you can't imagine it with the way it went. Like, for example, when Jefferson lost to Alexander Hamilton in persuading George Washington about the central bank. It's like, how did that happen? Washington originally had the same point of view as Jefferson. But somehow Hamilton came in and was so persuasive that Washington signed off on it. I mean,
they were former freaking soldiers.
Well,
and,
so the whole
army
for whatever the reasons, the arguments we don't have to go into now. The whole point is, there was this centralist idea from the beginning, and though we know that it wasn't ratified on this basis, we know the supporters were there, and they immediately started, whether through the courts or other ways, started implementing this. And so it makes it gives a good argument, not a correct one, but it gives a strong argument because these people were around from the beginning. So sometimes, and I haven't seen anyone do this very convincingly at all, in fact, in my experience, make an originalist argument for the centralization that we speak so strongly against. But it's certainly plausible, kind of like plausible deniability. It doesn't have to be true at all. It just has to be plausible, just a hint of something, and they can latch onto it. Whereas almost every mechanism, was against this, was for the disbursement of power. It was for all these Jeffersonian things we talk about, but anyway, enough said.
Yeah. So, no, all good stuff. Let me move on here.
Go ahead.
Because I want to pick through this little section, because I think the Kennedys wrote really well on this subject.
Oh yeah, go for it.
And they don't pull any punches, and they really, really identify. And this is the subject that they're really nailing here, and that is the fraudulent way that that new book, Defending Dixie's Land, also covers a little bit of it. But these guys really, they're the classic. But they go into just how crooked this process was. But let me go ahead and read, and I'll pause here and there, and then we can chat about it. So this is the South was right. I'm reading it. Just give them credit. Laws. So they're talking about the Northern attitude toward the Constitution as that leads up to this 14th Amendment. So anyway, they're talking about the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. and how the spirit, so I'll read here, quote, the spirit of our original constitution was to limit the power of the central government while protecting the liberties of the people within their states. Prior to the war for Southern independence, the Northern element used the method of loose construction to attack the spirit of the Constitution. To attempt to destroy the spirit of the Constitution reached its most destructive form when the North chose to use military force against the sovereign community in the Southern states to prevent them from recalling their delegated rights, in other words, seceding. The act of armed aggression, and this is what it took, and that's what Lincoln resorted to that at that point in 1861. The act of armed aggression by the North to force a new form of government upon the people of the South was in reality an attack upon this original spirit of the Constitution. The attack was an overwhelming success, as we know, for them. By the end of the war, the South lay prostrate. Her armies were physically exhausted. A large portion of her male population was either dead or maimed. Her political leaders were imprisoned, and her economy was totally destroyed. But worst of all, the spirit of the Constitution was dead.
Well,
and that is
Well said.
so accurate.
It's true. It's true. But if they weren't using a philosophical argument to invade the South, they claim to use a positive argument. Positive meaning written down law. Meaning, and so they
tried to, which was the first fraud.
It was
the
incorrect.
Next fraud is so he talked about the letter of the law and the spirit of the law.
Mm-hmm.
They destroyed the spirit of the law first. Well, then they worked on the letter.
Positivism
of the law here,
is the letter of the law, which needs to be
correct.
Understood. Right.
So I'll get into that here. The war and Reconstruction marked the end of the American constitutional republic. The officially accepted history or myth conveniently ignores the distinction between the American government after the war as compared to the government that existed before the war. Just as the imperialists of ancient Rome attempted to keep the trappings of the Roman Republic, the Yankee myth makers attempt to convince us that the current supreme federal government is a legitimate descendant and a natural continuation of the original American Republic established when the sovereign states ratified the Constitution in 1787-89. That's a lie. That's a complete friggin' lie.
And it's a bunch of crap.
Not only is a lie, but it's a
yeah. I mean, supreme federal government, and what kind of a warped mind could you say something like that? Unless you'd already been buying into this central government. There had to be something really malicious going on behind the scenes in their minds up in the northern states. You know, we talked about that Lincoln only wanted I don't want to let the South go. Where would my revenues go?
Of course.
This had to do with money.
His tariff war. Yeah. Yep.
Right. This was a much more basic problem
for a lot
of greed
of
and money and power.
Well, yeah, well, at the time, certainly, but go back to what you were saying a little bit earlier. People today assumed everything that in history happened is what should have happened. And that's the problem.
Well, that's supposed to happen.
You know? Yeah. And a lot of times you get monoconservatives kind of making this argument like, oh, they failed to see the burgeoning, glory of American nationhood or something like that, which are completely ridiculous arguments. These are completely just rhetorical arguments from a modern perspective. They might believe them, but they're not logical. They could only be asserted, if a person is trying to basically justify a position they have from a modern perspective looking backwards. The only way you can really take utility from history, as I've said it before, is if you do as best you can. Obviously, unless we go back in time, it would still be difficult, even if we were placed in the time. But everybody had limitations. Everybody had things they had to plan for, dangers that never came to fruition, but they still had to plan for them because they didn't know. This is true at every period in history. So it's really weird to look back at history and look at some of the decisions they made, and some of them look ridiculous. But that's why it's so important to understand what options were available to people at the time. What did they have to plan for, and what were their options?
Well, any historian knows, or anybody that's ever taken a history class, one of the first things they teach you is primary and secondary sources.
Right.
Primary sources gives you that window into their world.
Right.
You have
Right.
to understand their culture,
Absolutely.
their mores,
The context of
what
the
their
time.
perspective is
Yeah.
on the world at the time.
Why they made the decisions they made
Right.
at the time.
You can't go from modern to go back. That's presentism or modernism.
Yes, that's
if
correct.
it's ethnocentric. If you're using today's perspectives and values to judge yesterday,
It doesn't fit.
It's not
fit.
fair.
It's a
not
square peg
logical.
in a round hole. It did not fit at all.
Well, if you're taking today's perspectives and putting it into their world,
Mhm.
and you never live in their world, simply that's stupidity.
Well, yes, that's exactly what we're getting at.
I mean, it's just,
And that shows a complete disdain.
well, I
There's
think
a
a lot
couple
of
things
people
going
just
on.
assume.
The one,
remember, everybody
it's
assumes they're the first generation that ever existed. By the way, I've said that before. Also, you also get that where everybody just assumes, oh yeah, I mean, they did whatever they did in the past, but right now we're alive. This is the real deal. No, it was always the real deal, and you need to understand how the deal went before. Anyway, go ahead, Paul.
right. So there's that hubris part, but there's also in the northern section of the country at the time, and even today, there's a disdain. There's a pure disgust and disdain for that culture, for that history of the South, for that heritage.
Absolutely.
They do not care. And if you want to talk, then that's one. Those are the conservatives, the so-called conservatives.
Yeah.
Who look down upon the South and the Confederacy, et cetera, et cetera. It's easy for them to go throw slavery and white supremacy, right?
Yeah.
They don't even realize, or maybe they do, that it's really the Marxists. The Marxists want to erase history.
Right.
So it fits right into them. So it's this dual-pronged attack on the South. And here you have the South. That's all they ever wanted to do is just leave us the hell alone. Just leave us alone. You have that mindset against this massive, greedy power onslaught on them constantly. Every freaking day that we exist, they want us gone.
Yes.
So that started back here. I'm going to continue on because I want to try to get through this because there's some cool stuff in here about how pathetic these people were and their fraud. Oh my God.
Right.
So the Reconstruct, let me keep reading on him. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 declared that the Southern states were not part of the Union. Remember that.
Which is what we wanted to begin with.
Wait for it. You're exactly right, Todd.
amen.
Remember, this was the same union from which the North, under the control of the Republican Party, had previously said that these states could not withdraw.
And by the way, Lincoln was dead by that time. He
From
wouldn't have liked that. But anyway.
From 1866 to March 2nd, 1867, the Southern states were accorded the privilege of statehood in the Republican Party's union. Remember, this is very important here. They participated in the ratification of the 13th Amendment. So they let them participate actually voting in the 13th Amendment and the initial rejection of the 14th Amendment. What happened? The rejection of the 14th Amendment posed a major roadblock to the revolutionary schemes of the Republicans in Congress. Remember, Andrew Johnson vetoed it. Not only that, the states voted down. They knew that even after the successful military conquest of the Southern people, they could not complete their evil designs as long as the South retained even the slight amount of political power. To add even greater alarm to the Republicans in Congress at the time was the fact that after the passage of the 13th Amendment, blacks would now be counted not as 3/5 of a person as during the days of slavery, but now he would count as a full person. This meant a greater population for the South, which would translate into more representatives in Congress. Something had to be done to prevent the growth of the Southern power. After all, they initiated a war to exterminate Southern political power, not to increase it. So they just found themselves in a real conundrum, right? To further their evil schemes, the radicals decided to eject their conquered foe from Congress and then complete the revolution. To further the revolutionary and evil goals, the Northern element treated the Southern states alternately as states and as conquered territories. When Congress enacted the first so-called Reconstruction Act, it was promptly vetoed by President Andrew Johnson. The Republican-controlled Congress voted to override the veto the same day.
They knew it
The
was
fact
coming.
that Congress so quickly voted to override a presidential veto demonstrates just how committed the Republican Party was to this evil scheme. With the Southern people completely expelled from Congress, the Republican Party set about completing its work of destroying the original constitutional republic. And he goes on to say, so here, again, you see that the origins of how wicked this situation was.
Yeah.
And the Southerners were defeated. Economies wrecked, as he said, people are destroyed. Many of the men are dead or when they don't have any more energy for this. And just when you thought, so they gave statehood to the Southern states and then they took it back. They took it back because then they needed to vote for the 14th Amendment.
Right.
So here we go. So here, let me move on here. The enactment of the fraud. Republican Congressman Thaddeus Stevens declared, "We shall treat the South as a defeated enemy." Stevens and his fellow Republicans in Congress fulfilled this threat with the methods they used to secure the enactment of the 14th Amendment. At the time of the introduction of the amendment, there were 37 states in the Union. By mid-1867, the Federal Secretary of State had received official documents from the legislatures of 33 of the 37 states, giving the states answer to the proposed 14th Amendment. The result was a complete rejection of the radical amendment. The results were as follows. Number of states in the Union, 37. Needed to ratify, 28. So 28 of the 37 needed to ratify, 2/3. How many states voted yes? 22. How many states voted no? 12. How many states did not vote? 3. Mississippi's rejected the resolution, but it didn't reach Washington, and therefore it's numbered with the non-voting states. But even if the 3 non-voting states, that would add up non-voting 3 plus 22, that's 25. That's not 28. The Republicans in Congress realized that their attempt to secure passage by legal and constitutional methods had failed. Thus, the letter of the constitutional law survived in its initial post-war assault. But then you go to what they did, which is removed those southern states from the process, specifically for this 14th Amendment. To secure enactment of the amendment, Republicans Congress had to do this kind of craziness. One, they had to declare the southern states outside of this indivisible union that they'd created, right? Now they had to just push them out. How convenient. 2, they had to deny majority rule in the southern states by the disenfranchisement of large numbers of the white population. Remember, they called them in rebellion. 3, they had to require the southern states to ratify the amendment as the price of getting back into the union, from which heretofore they'd been denied at the point of bayonets the right to secede, as Todd mentioned. So you're looking at pure blackmail. Oh yeah, you can come back into the union if you vote in favor of the 14th Amendment. That's fraud and corruption on a massive scale.
Well, you don't even have to go that far to get into that, by the way. A lot of people forget, real quick aside here, the indemnification bills that were passed to excuse all the things Lincoln had done after he had done them. The Republicans during the war had to do that twice just for Lincoln to supposedly do whatever he did legally. So he did a bunch of stuff he wasn't supposed to do, a lot of really bad things. And then Congress just rubber stamped it after the fact. Anyway, go ahead.
I want to get
this was a pattern at the time, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So this is really interesting, and I want to talk because I always want to look at what some of the northern states were saying, and something really stands out is in the case of New Jersey. Believe it or not, this is what New Jersey wrote. They were so ticked off that what the radical Republicans had done. This is what they wrote in their resolution to this proposition. That it being necessary by the Constitution that every amendment to the same should be proposed by 2/3 of both houses of Congress, the authors of said proposition, the Republicans, radical Republicans, for the purpose of securing the assent of the requisite majority, determined to and did exclude from said two houses 80 representatives from 11 states of the Union, upon the pretense that there were no such states in the Union. But finding that 2/3 of the remainder of said houses could not be brought to assent to the said proposition, they deliberately formed and carried out the design of mutilating the integrity of the United States Senate, and without any pretext or justification other than the possession of the power without the right, in a palpable violation of the Constitution, they ejected a member of their own body representing this state, and thus denied New Jersey its equal suffrage in the Senate. That's unconstitutional. It's right there in the Article 9, Section 1 of the Constitution.
Was Vallandigham, New Jersey, or Delaware?
What?
Vallandigham, remember him?
Ohio.
Vallandigham.
Ohio.
He was Ohio?
Yeah.
Who
I'm
am I
almost
thinking of?
positive he was Ohio.
Who am I thinking of then?
You know what, Paul?
There's somebody in Delaware I'm thinking of. Sorry.
When you read something like that, it just shows how crooked the
It always
Yankee
was. Yeah.
federal government was. It like I listened to you read that, and literally
it's outrageous. It is outrageous.
It's coming from New Jersey,
It's
who finally realized the war being over. Remember, you got put things in context of the time. They know they'd beaten the South. Okay, they didn't want. Now they started to wake up and realize. Think about it, and I'll go on. Just Ohio and Oregon, same thing right here. You should. This is the coup de grace here. What the Republicans did. I'll get into it in just a second.
Well, Oregon's backwards, anyways. So
yeah, but I mean, they were right here. Ohio and Oregon. I'll tell you in a second. They joined New Jersey and just their condemnation of this. But New Jersey recognized. Wait a minute, you guys are going too far. We defeated the South, and we sent troops to your stupid war, and we lost X amount of people. But now you're going way too far, and for them to recognize that and then put it into a resolution is a pretty big deal. All right, paragraph 19 of the strongest attack upon. So there's a bunch of states that are chiming in here. I'm going to focus just quickly on Ohio and Oregon. Paragraph 19 of the strongest attack upon the amendment, protesting against its denial of the right of the states of the Union. Remember, they were defending the southern states at this time, to set up reasonable qualifications for voting, and claiming that it, quote, transfers to Congress the whole control of the right of suffrage in the state, a power which they, the states, have never been willing to surrender to the general government, and which was reserved to the states as a fundamental principle on which the Constitution itself was constructed, the principle of self-government. New Jersey was not the only northern state to recognize the fraud and corruption of the Republican-controlled Congress. The states of Ohio and Oregon both repealed their ratification of the 14th Amendment. So they went so far, realized what was going on, and said, oh, hell no. In October 1868, the legislature of Oregon issued a rescinding resolution stating that the amendment had not received ratification by 3/4 of the states, and that the forced ratification of the southern states was, quote, usurpations, unconstitutional, revolutionary, and now void. We remind the reader that these are words of this is the quote from the book. We remind the reader that these are the words of northern yet legislative bodies. Who can truthfully question those of us who agree with the assessment of this northern state legislature? These acts were and are unconstitutional and void. The legacy of crime and corruption extended even to the state legislature of Oregon. The two representatives from Grant County were refused their seats. Two imposters, Brents and McKean, filled the vacated seats and guess what? Voted for ratification. The victory margin for ratification in the Oregon legislature was very close. Even with two imposters voting for the amendment, it barely passed. 3 days later, when the legitimate representatives from Grant County were at last seated, they both signed statements that if they had been allowed to vote, they both would have voted against the amendment. Thus, it would never have passed the Oregon legislature. So a lot of shady stuff going on.
Yes.
Too many Southerners today even think that the present supreme federal government, I think you were mentioning this, Aaron, they think it's the same one that our founding fathers established. I mean, that's what we see today. We see so many people in the South. I mean, you think of these so-called supposed conservatives in the Republican Party, the Nikki Haley's, the Tim Scotts, all these people who they're not Southerners. I don't know what the hell they are.
Yeah.
It's almost like it's weird. I don't know if like, are people really abjectly that stupid? Are they that corrupt? Or do they have a gun to their head?
They don't know. They don't know and they don't care. These are politicians. They're not really interested in history. They are not really interested in history. Can anybody name a politician that was ever a historian? I mean, there may have been some legitimate or not, but
Newt Gingrich.
Was he a historian? Well, he was a bad one in that case. You know,
yeah, he's a bad one.
He's almost,
he's a Straussian nationalist.
Yeah, well, and that's why I don't think he's really a historian. I think you get a lot of these people that write these historical books, but this is like third and fourth source material. Right. You know, this is stuff that's based on an assumption. That's based on an assumption. You know, they're not going to original sources. They don't have an understanding of what was really going on at the time. Anybody who claims to be conservative could not possibly come down on this Lincolnian, by extension Hamiltonian, and ultimately leftist consolidationist side. It makes no sense at all. I forget who said this. It was somebody recently. But people assume the United States is a story of continuity. It's actually a story of discontinuity, and people need to remember that.
Well, you also have to remember that modern so-called politicians like Nikki Haley, and all these tool bags out there, they're there for one reason, and that's to please their constituents.
Of course,
that vote.
That's a very important point, because if your average constituent does not really understand history either, you know, you're not going to win by trying to say, hey, here's how it really happened.
You're preaching to the choir.
Yeah, and that's the big problem, is the common understanding is so askew that a politician really can't. And that's one of the reasons why so many conservative politicians would just, as I've said at all, you know, probably more episodes than not of this podcast, they just assume not have to deal with the Southern history. They just dismiss it. Some of them actively disparage it. Others try and, you know, play it a little safer. But at the end of the day, they would rather not have to deal with it as part of their job.
Well, again, the reason they don't want to deal with it, like I said earlier, is because they're afraid of it. Because they know that we speak the truth and that we have the only true identity. Well,
that's the only place I disagree. I don't think they know we speak the truth, and I don't think they care. You know, I don't think they're really.
I don't think that. Yeah, I agree.
Well, they're using it. They're using it for political advantage now that they're in their position that they are. Exactly. They're using the South as their cudgel. They're the scapegoat. Bad guy in the closet, the freaking boogeyman, whatever.
Yep, it's a scapegoat.
You know, one other thing I haven't mentioned with this is this element of this Hunger Games crap that the Union Army, the Lincoln, not the Lincoln administration because he was dead, but the Republicans did after the war. And when they passed the Reconstruction Act in 1867, it set up these military districts, right? I think, was it 5 or 6 of them?
I think there were 12 of them.
Okay. Yeah, because it's extended to the territories. I think 5 or 6 are in the states, and then it went out. But that's I mean, think about that.
Right.
They controlled everything.
They did.
They wouldn't allow the governors of those states to convene.
Well, and keep in mind, these were military governors that were running these things. These were political appointees. These weren't elected people. The whole period of Reconstruction was political Reconstruction. Just like you said earlier, you know, they had this situation where now they had all of these freedmen who could now vote. They were no longer 3/5 of a man. They were now one man. And so therefore they had to control the political reconstruction of the South, which they certainly did. And a lot of keep in mind the South was integrated before the war.
Oh yeah.
This segregation and the discord that was sown between people was largely a part of the influence of these they were down there for 12 years in these military districts. It was political reformation. It was political reformation that would be favorable to the conquering party, and the consequences of that are with us to this day. It's a terrible thing. I mean, it's just absolutely outrageous. A good amount, a substantial amount. If not, I need to do a little more research on this, but I think we should do a whole episode on this. The negativity between blacks and whites in the South were largely fostered by Northern politicians that came down. I forget which one it was. I forget his name. He was in Louisiana, but one of he was a Republican military governor, said that slavery was preordained by God. Here's a Republican who was appointed military governor post-war, and he was saying stuff like that. I mean, there are the outrageous stuff that these guys were into that they're on the record for. I mean, is just gives you a real sign of the paradigm of the times. But yeah, I mean, so anyway, I could go.
Yeah, I mean, so you had a lot of shadow government stuff going on, and
it wasn't shadow government. It was out in the open.
No, I mean on the southern part, they didn't have any government. It was
they had none. Yeah,
they had
if only
shadow government, meaning I don't know, it wasn't doing anything, and it didn't contribute.
Well, y'all were talking about how many districts they were broken up into. There was 5 districts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought it was 5 or 6.
First military district was Virginia, obviously because we were to see the war. Second military district was North Carolina, South Carolina. Third military district was Georgia, Alabama, Florida.
I was incorrect then.
Fourth military district was Arkansas, Mississippi. Fifth was Texas and Louisiana.
Yeah.
So they were broken up, but Virginia got the worst of it.
Yeah.
Because obviously
it was military district number 1, all Virginia?
All Virginia.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's hard to just carry on with an army in your former country, your state.
Well, you have no rights.
Yeah, you have no.
You have no rights. You don't even have property. You're barely scraping. You've just sucked in all of your money, all of your land, all of your assets into the war. You have nothing, and now these people. As General Lee used to say, these people are running everything for years and dictating who you will vote for. And then you have the scalawag, the punks, the Southerners who were scalawags, pro-Northern central government freaks, pro-Union, and the carpetbaggers coming in and, like many do even today, infiltrate the town governments, the city governments in the South and turn it into a Marxist crap show. The elements were still there. It happened in a defeated South, but I don't know. We weren't defeated. We're still around.
Right.
We love our ancestors and our descendant. We're descended from them.
There were also. Go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
We're going to try to point this out every step of the way out. Go ahead before I'm going to go
ahead.
Well,
I just wanted to say that there were those who were governors of some of those southern military districts that were calling for the extermination of all Southern people, by the way.
Yeah.
There were several calling for a second war, and that could be a topic for another discussion.
Yeah, they again, that mindset still exists today.
Right.
They have no regard.
Yeah. I mean, so you were saying we still exist. It's only because we weren't exterminated then, but there were some that were absolute extremists that were calling for that. So that needs to be noted. And people didn't know that wasn't going to happen at the time.
So we're going to try to keep exposing the truth and bring out some very inconvenient facts when it comes to Southern heritage, and certainly the war for Southern independence or war between the states. And so appreciate you guys spend a little time, and thanks for chiming in. It's a good subject. 14th Amendment. I think it's pretty complicated. Go ahead.
Something I think we need to talk about sometime in the future. I texted you. I was listening to a show the other day, and they were discussing this post-war period and saying how this had to be done to keep the white Southerners from removing the rights of the freed blacks. And, this is the basis for segregation and Jim Crow laws and all that stuff. They're getting a little ahead of themselves when they say Jim Crow laws, obviously.
Right.
But, they just beat up on the South some more and more. And it really pissed me off, but I had no way to get in that discussion or anything.
I got a bunch of stuff I could say about that.
Well, yeah.
So,
I'm thinking at the time, why are you not mentioning any of the laws in the northern states that said free blacks could not come into their states?
Right.
You laid this burden all on the South, the southern states. It's all their fault. And yet, like it or not, it was a time of discrimination.
Well, right.
It's the way the world
Context
had been.
of the times.
Well, it was at least legal to be black in the South. They were subordinate, but so were women, and that was the same situation in the North.
Yeah.
All right. So keep in mind. But that statement that person made that you're commenting on is based on the premise that somehow the North had to protect the rights of blacks when they were trying to eliminate them outright.
When they wouldn't even allow them into their state.
Yeah. And so somehow they had to stop Southerners from oppressing blacks when they were actually trying to eliminate them, free or slave. A free state did not mean free for blacks. It meant free only for whites. Anyway, it's all connected.
Well, we'll get it.
We should talk about that.
We will get into that next time. That's a great subject because there's a lot on it, and it's not.
Oh yeah, please.
It's not easy.
Please talk about
it?
How many Union generals had servants.
Oh, that's right.
And
we pointed that out in the last podcast.
Up until they died.
We did. Yeah.
But there were more. There were more. Yeah.
So we'll get into that next time. So appreciate you guys. But so again, this is American Reckoning Podcast. Thanks for chiming in, and make sure that you like us, like our page. We're also on Rumble at American Reckoning Podcast. Or at American Reckoning on YouTube. So that's our channel. And come back next time and see us. Thanks for joining.
All right, buddy.
Adios.
I have nothing for myself.